Thank you for joining me today to learn more about the question of political participation in the American Revolution. My name is Jim Gigantino, and I'm a faculty member in the history department at the University of Arkansas. And for the past 15 years, I've been studying the American Revolutionary era in New Jersey. Today, we are going to explore some larger themes of the American Revolution, specifically thinking about the causation of the war and the question of loyalty. I'll also be introducing a concept called multiplicities of revolution as a way to help think about the multiple ways that Americans thought about and engaged in this pivotal time period. Before I shift to a case study on New Jersey specifically to apply these concepts to the Garden State. But first, let's explore the causes of the American Revolution. Historians have traditionally delineated causation of the revolution into two main overarching frameworks, ideology and economics. Of course, it's far more complicated than these two, but we will get into that a little more when we approach the idea of multiple revolutions. The ideological origins of the American Revolution comes from a powerful historical work of the same name written by Bernard Bailyn in 1967. Bailyn was an influential historian at Harvard University who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, a National Book Award, and the highest award given to an American historian, the Bancroft Prize. Bailyn likewise trained dozens of historians who continued to study the revolution, challenging the predominant view at the time that the revolution was economically motivated. Bailyn believed in the power of pamphlet literature that circulated widely throughout the colonies in this time period. Many of these pamphlets were concentrated and concerned about the question of freedom, specifically political freedom, and were distrustful of the harsh governmental controls that British Parliament had imposed on the colonies. People wrote about freedom abstractly in these pamphlets. They saw freedom as singular, that much of the political freedom discussed was somehow the same regardless of who you were. Historians like Bailyn have used these pamphlets to argue that these were not elements of propaganda, but instead reflected real concerns and fears of the colonists. These colonists believed that the revolution was an ideological, constitutional, and a political struggle, not economic or a social struggle between different groups or classes. Moreover, they reveal the influence of Enlightenment thought. They do not want to overthrow the existing social order, but instead try to support liberty threatened by the apparent corruption of how the colonists were being governed. This outlook on the American Revolution was challenged by a new group of historians who came of age really in the 1980s. These historians, unlike those in the early 20th century who argued for a much baser economic interest as causation of the war, believed that the revolution was not just about ideology, but about ideology over economics. These social historians, interested in the interplay between classes with a much more granular focus on the common people of the American Revolution, saw the economic situation had degraded these common people's condition. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the colonies suffered significant economic effects of Parliament's actions to remedy the debt accumulated in fighting France and her allies in that conflict. The Stamp Act, though important in the drama of the unfolding revolutionary era, created more of a conflict not because of the tax imposed by it, but instead by the idea that the colonists were in some ways being double taxed, or in reality, taxed enough already. The Navigation Acts, which were created in the early 1700s, mandated that colonial goods be shipped by British ships only. They created a ready monopoly that could levy higher prices on colonial goods, which colonists took as a tax upon them. The Stamp Act, as a second tax and a direct one versus the indirect nature of the Navigation Acts, was a bridge too far for many who had thought themselves loyal members of the British Empire. It was these economic conditions that were against American freedom. Lately, historians have really begun to push to think about the American Revolution through the lens of a multiplicity of revolutions going on at the same time. There is a significant amount of conflict among social classes and races, while at the same time the political drama was ongoing. This really gets to the heart of the question of why Americans decided to fight or not to fight in the American Revolution. Often we think about the causation of conflict and motivation of those who fought as the same thing. They can be, but not necessarily. Throughout American history, people have fought in wars for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they were drafted. Sometimes they signed up for pay. Sometimes for adventure. Sometimes for patriotism. It depended on the person, the time period, and the opportunity cost of joining the military. Between 1775 and 1783, about 200,000 men fought in the American Army and the militia. Not all of these men believed in the American cause. If we think about that famous winter of 1776, after George Washington had been beaten back from New York, had fled across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania before crossing back over the Delaware River on Christmas evening to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The timing of that event happened because the vast majority of his soldiers' enlistments would expire at the end of December. Those men had been hired to fight for a limited period of time. Some would have stayed for patriotic reasons, but many more had done their time and would have left. When it comes to this multiplicity argument, we need to think about this too in terms of race and class. For example, some historians call the American Revolution one of the largest slave revolts in world history, since African slaves saw joining the Loyalist cause and supporting the British as a key to their freedom. Thousands of slaves fled to British lines and fought against their American owners. Now, that doesn't mean that all slaves fought for the British. We do have some examples of enslaved or free blacks fighting for the Continental Army or serving in the militia, but far more likely they served with the British as the British promised freedom for African Americans who escaped their patriot masters. The same goes for Native Americans. Many Indian tribes were fighting their own revolution against colonial encroachment on their lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Most, but not all, saw an alliance with the British as key to their success in warding off this colonial encroachment. A lot of this idea of political participation in the American Revolution is wrapped up in what one historian calls the myth of the Minuteman. We have this idea that the Minuteman, the citizen soldier who is emotionally bonded to his home and community, was the one who fought the war. It was likely a large majority of property-owning men served in the militia during the war, but very few joined the regular army. As the war progressed, enlistment among property-owning men dwindled. As time continued, more men from the lower echelons of society enlisted so that others would not have to fight. These men were substitutes, so that propertied men would not have to fight, while others who got involved in the Continental Army did so because they could get a bounty, or essentially a wartime payment by richer men to serve in those richer men's place. Being a militia substitute was actually more lucrative than serving in the Continental Army. Hence why Washington had such difficulty in enlisting men in his military service. More damaging than enlistments, however, was the fact that many Americans just didn't show up for militia duty when called. In New Jersey, that was a common occurrence, largely because the state legislature never imposed a significant penalty that compelled militia service, despite constant pleas from George Washington and Governor William Livingston. The regular army of Washington then was really a hodgepodge of people. Most were not landowners, but instead laborers, mechanics, wage laboring farmhands, fresh immigrants from Germany or Ireland, convicts recently released from jail, or others who were poor and desperate. Many of them had three things in common: youth, a lower social and economic standing, and little attachment to any particular community. For example, in Concord, Massachusetts, the place where the war started, the town could not fill its quota for enlistments for the army. Ezekiel Brown, who had heard the shots that started the war from the town's jail, where he was sitting as a debtor in debtor's prison, joined up because he had nothing to lose. He was voteless, landless, and poverty-stricken. He had no attachment to Concord, but at the same time, he saw an opportunity, a revolution of his own, to seek economic success through this avenue. The other missing piece we see when we are blinded by this myth of the Minuteman is the role of non-Americans in fighting for the colonies. At the outbreak of the revolution, American political leaders knew they could not win the revolution without gaining a strong European ally to support them. Eventually, France, Spain, and the Netherlands joined the conflict. French troops served directly in the colonies, fighting for American independence, while the French Navy and Army attacked British outposts and colonies in the Caribbean and beyond. Likewise, the Spanish attacked British-controlled Florida and waged war along the Gulf Coast, and the Dutch engaged British troops in the Atlantic and beyond, forcing the British to devote significant military resources to fight those threats instead of using them against the colonies. Perhaps even more importantly, French and Dutch loans floated a largely bankrupt American government, enabling the colonies to fight a war and continue with that support. Without that support of these third parties, the Minutemen would not have guns, gunpowder, or food to survive. The final theme I would like to touch on is that of Loyalists. Loyalists took many forms in the American Revolution. They were wealthy merchants, planters, English lawyers, as well as newly arrived English middling and elite people. Some Loyalists were also those who were afraid of too much social change. William Franklin, Ben Franklin's son, the last royal governor of New Jersey, who you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, was too afraid of, in his words, liberty-mad men engineering a needless revolution. Now, for William, his social, political, and economic future were all wrapped up in his service as the colony's governor. So we have to take his thoughts with a little bit of a grain of salt. There were also ordinary farmers who became loyalists. In many cases, loyalists were the patriots' enemies. The regulators in North Carolina who were bitter at the now patriots who had oppressed them, the upcountry South Carolina farmers who hated the patriot merchants centered in Charleston, and the tenants along the Hudson River Valley who hated their patriot masters, quickly sided with the British against their patriot landowners. Again, our historical understandings of loyalism have evolved over the last 50 years on this question too. In the 1970s, loyalism would have been tied to a belief that the crown was the proper ruler of the colonies. While belief is important, American actors like George Washington and New Jersey's Governor William Livingston were far more interested in actions than beliefs. In their discussions about loyalists, essentially anyone who did anything to support the British military qualified as a loyalist. That would include trading supplies, even for payment, or, of course, serving in the British military. This fundamentally remakes the idea of a loyalist from this historical perspective. People from every walk of life became loyalists. It just depended in that moment in time if they could see a benefit from supporting the crown. This goes for some of the largest groups of loyalists, enslaved African Americans who escaped their patriot masters to British lines and freedom, as well as the majority of Native Americans who sided against the Patriots in favor of the British, who promised not to extend into their territory. Patriots were obsessed with trying to prove loyalty. The continental associations of the pre-war period, which supported non-importation, were revived during the war, and patriots demanded that everyone sign these associations as a loyalty oath. If you did not sign the oath, then you could get harassed or lose out on key things like positions of political power. If you did take up arms in the British service, then your land and property was confiscated and auctioned off. On the British side, however, loyalism was far more studied after the Revolution. The Loyalist Claims Commission, set up to assess damages due to colonists because of their loyalism, took a hard line on what a loyalist was, especially through studying actions. Joining the military or continued service towards the British Army or Crown was imperative in proving loyalty. However, it's important to note that filing a claim was not easy. Most from the lower rungs of society might have been loyalists, but they never filed a claim. The expense of traveling to the commission in either London or eventually when they opened up shop in Canada, was costly, and getting the necessary supporting documents to prove loyalty was difficult. Therefore, it's important to note that while these records show a lot of different pictures of loyalism, actions spoke louder than ideology in proving loyalty. How do these larger concepts relate to the New Jersey example? We are going to explore two ideas in our case study: the revolutionary multiplicities in New Jersey and the question of loyalty. First, the causation of the war and this multiplicity argument. We'll explore this through William Livingston, New Jersey's first revolutionary governor, who was a major player in a number of arenas. Livingston was very tepid towards the war at the beginning. He represented the thousands of moderates in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey who did not support strong action against Great Britain and increasingly suggested limited intervention against British policies in 1774, 1775, and early 1776. He went to Philadelphia, representing New Jersey to the First and the Second Continental Congress. On the ideological front, he believed in the unconstitutional nature of Parliament's actions against the colonies and the economic means through boycotts that Congress supported. He believed that Parliament had usurped the rights of the Crown after the 1688 Glorious Revolution and began to interfere with the colonies, something that should only have been the province of the king. In the Second Continental Congress, he served on the committee that drafted the Declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms in the summer of 1775. This used a natural rights rhetoric that challenged the constitutionality of Parliament's actions and insisted on military readiness. This moment is key. Livingston served the longest in Congress from New Jersey and was at the forefront of the military affairs of the colonies in two ways. First, he served on committees in Congress that were dealing with troop recruitment and supply issues. And second, he actually commanded the East Jersey militia during his time in Congress. Livingston understood intently the weakness of the American military and the difficulty they would have had in actually winning a war. He was likewise concerned about the destabilization of American society because of the war. In January of 1776, he began to participate in the Lord Drummond peace proposal. Drummond was working on an accommodation plan that he worked secretly on to try and reconcile the specific concerns over taxation and local control of economic concerns. Drummond believed that Livingston's in Drummond's words, much avarice from independency, because Livingston, quote, foresees that this species of government would have been attended with numberless immediate evils to that part of the continent where his property and everything connected with him lay, end quote. Now, New Jersey was changing in 1776. The provincial Congress was becoming more Whiggish and therefore more radical, Whig meaning opposition. Livingston's fellow delegate to Congress, John DeHart, ran for the provincial Congress in the summer of 1776 in an effort to control it because he believed that that was actually a far more important position since someone, in DeHart's words, needed to control the mad fellows who now control that body. The key change came in May of 1776, when more radical lower classes had gained the power to vote by the liberalization of voting requirements in New Jersey. 50 pounds of personal property, not real property. Now, this was a huge liberalization. This radicalization by the lower classes pushed New Jersey over the edge towards revolution. But Livingston still didn't support things for two reasons. One, he still believed that the American military was unprepared. And two, he wanted an ally first before the war was declared, not later. And he really didn't believe that France would ever join the colonies and fight for independence of a republic against a fellow monarchy. Now, Livingston probably also had some economic motivations too. A lot of his land and property and money was tied up in places, as the Lord Drummond proposal was being drafted, as Lord Drummond talked about, he had a lot to lose economically from this move towards revolution. In the end, when it came for discussions of the Declaration of Independence, the new provincial Congress created a new slate of delegates that didn't include William Livingston. He is essentially ejected, and a more radical slate is seated to support independence when independence is voted upon in July of 1776. This illustrates the important ideas of the complicated nature of the causation of revolution by showing the role that class plays in radicalizing the state, while at the same time illustrating reactions by elite moderates like William Livingston. Our final case study will be exploring the question of loyalty. In New Jersey, it is difficult to really understand who is a loyalist and who is not. New York was a base for Loyalists, and the late 1776 occupation of most of New Jersey made many in the state choose to support the king in droves. On this slide, you can see a petition from after the Revolution from the Loyalist Claims Commission, which we talked about a little earlier. In this petition, the petitioner makes clear that as soon as the British Army entered New Jersey, he says, on their first landing, that he rendered them every aid in his power during the whole of the war, particularly in his profession, which in this man's case was as a doctor in the British Army. We see a lot of people switching allegiances between the British and the Americans during the course of the war. To prove his loyalty to the British, this petitioner made a point to really make clear that he had been loyal from the very beginning to the very end of the war, and had never wavered because so many other people had. This idea of wavering loyalty can most readily be seen through what is called the London trade. Governor William Livingston and other patriot leaders realized that the state's geography was particularly problematic in actually helping to define what a loyalist was. As you can see from the map here, the border was quite porous. Sometimes the boundary with Staten Island could be easily jumped over. This porous border allowed for the London trade to develop, which was essentially a trade of illegal goods from New Jersey to New York City. New Jerseyans were in search of gold and silver that the hungry British Army offered for New Jersey foodstuffs instead of worthless paper currency that the Continental Army could muster. London traders, as they became known, could easily avoid American military lines and illegally trade with almost impunity. Part of the dilemma with London traders for Livingston and other state leaders was the issue of loyalty. By 1779, London traders made up more of the Loyalist threat for Livingston than any other group. But was a London trader actually a Loyalist? The ease at which geography created the London trade actually meant that ideology played very little part in the decision to engage in illegal trade with the enemy. Now, Livingston argued forcefully that anyone who aided the enemy in wartime was a Loyalist traitor and deserved to be executed. He agreed with George Washington, who wanted New Jersey to have a strong law that allowed for executions for trading with the enemy. But the legislature never passed such a law. The frequency that people actually evaded the law challenged how individual New Jerseyans saw its illegality. Most juries acquitted those who evaded the law. They didn't sanction those for doing exactly what they themselves were doing too. The ease at which people could illegally trade with the enemy, be it deemed loyalist by the state government, but not suffer the consequences of that, makes clear the complexity of the story of loyalism and how people perceive loyalism in New Jersey versus what the government perceives as loyalist activity, especially in this border state like New Jersey was during the American Revolution. Thank you very much for joining me in this look at political participation in the American Revolution. I hope you'll take a look at the frequently asked questions, as well as some of the information about further reading on the American Revolution more broadly and in New Jersey specifically. Thank you very much.